Imagine being born with a feature so rare, so impossible, that every doctor, every midwife, every scientist who saw you whispered the same thing. This should not be possible. Yet in the darkest days of American slavery, one woman entered the world with snow-white hair from the moment she took her first breath. Some called her a miracle. Others called her cursed, but no one, not even the top physicians of the era, could explain how a young enslaved woman carried a trait seen nowhere else on the plantation, or the world around her. Today, we uncover the forgotten story behind one of history's most unexplained genetic mysteries, the slave woman born with white hair, the strange mystery science couldn't explain. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? There exists a story so extraordinary, so bewildering, that it has challenged the very foundations of medical science for more than a century. A story that was buried in the archives of forgotten records, hidden away in dusty courthouse documents, and whispered about in communities across the American South. A story about a woman whose very existence seemed to contradict everything we understood about human biology. In the year 1873, in a remote plantation county in Georgia, a child was born who would become the subject of the most perplexing medical mystery of her time. This was not a child born to privilege, not a child whose life would be recorded in the grand histories. This was a child born into bondage, born into chains, born into a life of unimaginable hardship. And yet, from the moment she drew her first breath, she was marked by something so visibly, so undeniably unusual, that those who witnessed her birth could barely comprehend what they were seeing. The child had hair as white as fresh snow, pure white, crystalline white. But this was not the gradual whitening that comes with age, that gentle loss of pigmentation that arrives with decades. This whiteness was there from her earliest moments of life. From the very first instant she existed in this world, her hair was not the dark hair of her parents, not the rich, deep coloring characteristic of African heritage. It was white, completely, utterly white. The plantation doctors examined her with bewilderment. The healers who had delivered hundreds of children looked at her in confusion. There was no explanation. There was no precedent. She was not an albino, for her skin bore the natural tone of her ancestry. Her eyes held their proper coloring. Only her hair, this singular feature of her hair, defied all conventional understanding. It was as though nature itself had made an error, had written something into her very being that shouldn't have been possible. Her parents were enslaved people, both of them bearing the typical characteristics you would expect. Her mother had dark, coiled hair, rich and full. Her father, too, carried the genetic markers of his people. Yet between them, somehow, impossibly, they produced a child whose crowning feature appeared to belong to someone entirely different, to someone from a different world altogether. Word of this unusual birth spread through the region. In those days, news traveled slowly, moving through whispers and conversations, shared from one plantation to another, carried by travelers and merchants who moved through those territories. But it moved, and it grew, and with every retelling, the story became more laden with mystery, more heavy with questions that nobody could answer. Medical professionals of that era became increasingly intrigued. Some traveled considerable distances specifically to examine this child. They took measurements. They documented their observations with meticulous detail. They hypothesized theories that ranged from the reasonable to the absolutely fantastical. Some suggested it was the result of a traumatic event during pregnancy. Others proposed that it was evidence of something inherited, some hidden genetic factor that had emerged without warning. Still others ventured into realms of speculation that bordered on the theatrical, suggesting causes that had more to do with superstition than science. But none of them had an answer. None of them could provide a satisfactory explanation for what they were witnessing. The child remained an enigma, a living contradiction to everything that the medical science of that time claimed to understand about human heredity and physical development. And as she grew, the mystery did not diminish. If anything, it only deepened, only became more profound, more impossible to reconcile with the existing knowledge of the era. Yet this is not where the story begins to truly disturb, to truly confound. This is merely the opening chapter of a narrative that would eventually involve connections to the very highest levels of scientific inquiry. Strange coincidences that seem to accumulate around her life, and circumstances so unusual that they would haunt researchers for generations to come. The white hair was only the first strange element, the first indication that there was something about this woman, about her very existence, that did not fit into the normal patterns of human experience. The child's name was Frances. Frances Whitmore, though her surname would change many times throughout her life, as the circumstances of bondage and then freedom reshaped her existence. Those who knew her in her earliest years remembered her as a quiet child, intelligent beyond her years, but marked always by that peculiar feature that made her instantly recognizable, instantly memorable to anyone who encountered her. The plantation where she was born was not one of the largest in Georgia, but it was established, with records that went back generations. The owner, a man named Thomas Harrow, had documented his property with the meticulous attention that many planters of that era employed. His records included descriptions of enslaved people, their skills, their lineages, their value. And in those records there is an entry for Frances, made when she was merely months old. The entry describes her white hair. The entry expresses puzzlement. The entry notes that no explanation has been forthcoming from anyone who has examined her. In the quarters where enslaved families lived, Frances was viewed with a mixture of feelings. Some saw her white hair as a mark of connection to something beyond their understanding, something mysterious and perhaps powerful. Others worried that it marked her as different in ways that might bring attention she did not desire. In those times, being visible, being noteworthy, being the subject of curiosity could bring consequences both intended and unintended. The safer path was to remain unremarkable, to blend into the rhythms of plantation life, to avoid catching the eye of those who held power. But Frances could not blend in. Her appearance would not allow it. No matter how she covered her hair, no matter how she tried to move through the world without drawing attention, people noticed. Children who encountered her would stare. Adults would do double takes, their eyes drawn to her repeatedly even when they tried to focus elsewhere. She was, in her very physical presence, a question mark that her society had no way to answer. As she entered her childhood years, roughly between the ages of 3 and 8, the American nation was moving toward the cataclysm of the Civil War. The world in which Frances was growing up was one of profound instability, of accelerating tensions, of a society that was fracturing along lines of ideology and economic interest. In the midst of this, Frances remained on the plantation, growing, developing, becoming a person. She learned to read and write through informal instruction from an older enslaved woman who had herself learned these skills years before. She was quick to learn, quick to understand. Her mind was sharp and active. By the time Frances was 8 years old, the Union Army was moving through Georgia. The war had come to her region. The familiar structures of plantation life, which had seemed so permanent and unchangeable, were beginning to crumble. The plantation was raided. The enslaved people on the property saw the possibility of freedom suddenly become tangible. Many fled toward the Union lines. Some remained, uncertain about what freedom would mean, afraid of the unknown that awaited them. Frances was among those who fled. She left the plantation along with several other enslaved people, moving toward what they believed would be liberation. The journey was difficult. Food was scarce. The roads were dangerous. There were patrols and checkpoints. But they made it to the Union Army's lines. They made it to freedom, at least in the formal legal sense. They were no longer property. They were no longer owned. But freedom in the years immediately following the Civil War was a complicated and uncertain thing, especially for a young girl with white hair who attracted attention everywhere she went. Frances found herself in refugee camps, in temporary settlements where freed people were attempting to rebuild their lives from nothing. She was now perhaps 10 or 11 years old. She had no family that she knew of who had survived the war's chaos. She had no resources, no connections, no safety net of any kind. It was during this period in one of these settlement camps near Atlanta that she came to the attention of a man named Dr. William Harrington. Dr. Harrington was a northern physician who had come south with the occupying Union forces. He was genuinely interested in medical advancement and in understanding the health conditions of formerly enslaved people who had endured such extraordinary trauma. He was not without his biases. No man of that era was entirely free of them, but he was motivated by genuine curiosity and a desire to document his observations scientifically. Dr. Harrington saw Frances, or rather, he sought his hair first, as everyone did, but he was a doctor, which meant he saw beyond the immediate surface. He saw a medical specimen that did not fit into any category he had ever encountered. He arranged to meet with her to conduct an examination. He took what he called detailed notes on her physical condition. He examined her hair under magnification. He documented the texture, the structure, the complete absence of pigmentation. He asked her questions about when her hair had turned white, though of course she had no memory of such a turning because it had never turned. It had simply always been white. Through his examination and documentation, Dr. Harrington became convinced that he had encountered something genuinely unusual. He began making copies of his notes. He began drafting a paper that he intended to submit to medical journals. He believed that the case of Frances Whitmore represented a genuine anomaly that could advance the field of dermatology and perhaps shed light on the mysteries of hereditary traits. But before Dr. Harrington could publish his findings, something happened that would alter the trajectory of Frances's life entirely. He received word that he was being reassigned. The Union occupation was changing. Its priorities were shifting. He was being sent to a different region. He had to leave Atlanta. And in the confusion of his departure, something occurred that would prove to be fateful. His detailed notes and preliminary draft were left behind in a military hospital. They were filed away. They were moved to archives. They were eventually lost to history, or at least lost to easy recovery. Frances, meanwhile, moved on. She was a young orphan in a chaotic time. She was taken in by a missionary organization that was attempting to help freed people during Reconstruction. She learned various trades. She learned domestic skills. She learned how to navigate a world that was hostile and uncertain. She was perhaps 15 years old when she met Samuel Prince, a man who was himself a freed person, a man who had worked as a skilled carpenter before the war. They married. It was not a marriage of great romance, but it was a partnership, an arrangement that offered both of them a degree of stability and companionship in a dangerous world. For several decades, Frances lived in relative obscurity. She moved with her husband from Georgia to the Carolinas. They settled in a small community where Samuel's carpentry skills were valued. They had children of their own, and here is where the story begins to take an even more remarkable turn. Her children, surprisingly, were born with normal hair pigmentation. They did not inherit the white hair. Their hair was dark, as one would expect given their parentage and their ancestry. This fact that her children's hair showed no sign of the unusual pigmentation that marked Frances only deepened the medical mystery. It suggested that whatever caused her condition was not following the normal patterns of hereditary inheritance. Life continued. The years moved forward. The 20th century arrived. Frances grew older. She aged as people do. Her white hair remained white, of course, since it had never had pigmentation to begin with. She became a grandmother. She became part of the fabric of a small community. She became in many ways ordinary, despite the extraordinary feature that had marked her from birth. But then, in 1923, something extraordinary occurred. A medical student named Richard Fletcher, who was conducting research on unusual dermatological conditions, discovered a reference to Dr. William Harrington's original notes. The reference appeared in an old archive of military medical records, buried deep in files that had been transferred from one institution to another over the decades. The note was fragmentary, incomplete, but it contained enough information to intrigue Fletcher. It mentioned a child with white hair, an African-American girl born during slavery with this unusual trait, and mentioned that the original documentation had been created by Dr. Harrington. Driven by curiosity, Fletcher began searching for information about Dr. Harrington. Through his university connections and through careful research, he tracked down the original notes. They were held in a military archive in Washington, D.C., stored in boxes of miscellaneous medical records that had accumulated over decades. The notes were there, written in Harrington's careful handwriting, describing in detail the examination of young Frances Whitmore and his theories about her condition. But the notes also contained something else that would prove to be crucial. They contained a detailed description that included enough specific information that, with some effort, someone might be able to track down whether the subject of those notes still existed, whether Frances herself might still be alive. Fletcher obtained permission to conduct further research. He began looking for Frances Whitmore, or Frances Prince, or any variation of her name that might appear in records from the Carolinas from the period in question. This search was not easy. Records were scattered. Documentation was incomplete. But it was not impossible. And after months of investigation, driven by genuine scientific curiosity and by a desire to follow up on what he believed could be a significant medical case, Fletcher found her. Frances was now well into her 60s, living quietly in a small house on the outskirts of a town in South Carolina. She was a grandmother, a respected member of her community, a woman known for her kindness and her wisdom. She was also a woman who still, to that day, possessed hair that was entirely white. When Fletcher arrived at her door, Frances was cautious. She was wary of being studied, of being treated as a curiosity. She had lived with that her entire life. She had learned to distrust the attention of strangers, particularly strangers who saw her as something to be examined and documented rather than as a person to be known and respected. But Fletcher was persistent. He explained his research. He explained that he believed her case could advance medical science. He showed her the original notes by Dr. Harrington. He asked her if she would be willing to participate in a more thorough examination. After some consideration, after consulting with family members who trusted her judgment, Frances agreed. She submitted to a more comprehensive medical examination than she had undergone in decades. Fletcher was more thorough than Harrington had been, more systematic. This was the 20th century after all, and medical science had advanced. Better equipment was available. Better techniques for examination existed. What Fletcher found was both confirming and puzzling. The hair was indeed entirely devoid of pigmentation. The follicles themselves appeared to be functioning normally, but they were producing no melanin whatsoever. The root structure was normal. The hair growth pattern was normal. Everything about the mechanism of hair growth seemed to be working as it should. Yet the end product was hair without color, completely white, impossibly white. Fletcher conducted various tests. He examined Frances's skin, looking for other signs of depigmentation. He found none. Her skin tone was normal. Her eyes held their natural coloring. Only the hair showed this unusual characteristic. He took blood samples and conducted the basic blood work that was available at that time. He examined her scalp carefully. He documented everything with meticulous attention. And then he asked her the question that had probably been asked of her countless times before, but which now took on particular significance. Had she experienced any trauma? Any shock? Any significant emotional event around the time of her birth? Or in her very early childhood that might have triggered an unusual physiological response? Frances's answer was unexpected. She told Fletcher that her earliest memories included recollections of extreme fear. She remembered, or believed she remembered, a time of profound chaos and danger when she was very young. She remembered hiding. She remembered hearing voices raised in anger and in violence. She remembered her own terror and the terror of those around her. She could not pinpoint exactly when these memories occurred, whether they were from her first months of life or from her earliest childhood years. But she carried them, embedded in her consciousness, recurring in her dreams and in moments of stress. What Frances did not know, what neither she nor Fletcher knew at that time, was that the events she was describing in her fragmentary early memories occurred during the early years of the Civil War, during a period when the plantation where she was born was raided by Union soldiers, during a time of extraordinary violence and chaos. The trauma she remembered, or at least the time frame she was describing, corresponded to the most tumultuous period of her childhood, the period when everything in her world had become unstable and terrifying. Fletcher returned to his university with extensive notes and photographs of his examination of Frances. He began drafting a formal medical paper describing his findings. The medical community of the 1920s was more developed than it had been in Harrington's time, but it was not yet equipped with the genetic understanding that would eventually emerge. The mechanisms of heredity were still being worked out. The role of genes in determining traits was still being discovered and systematized. So while Fletcher could describe what he observed, explaining the mechanism by which it occurred was still largely beyond the capacity of medical science. He published his findings in a small medical journal in 1925. The paper attracted some attention, particularly in academic circles, but it did not create the sensation that one might have expected from such an unusual case. The broader medical community had become more skeptical of anomalies, more skeptical of cases that didn't fit neatly into established categories. There was a tendency to view unusual cases with a kind of skepticism, wondering whether something else might not explain them, some other factor that had been overlooked. But Fletcher's paper was noticed by certain researchers who were beginning to explore the emerging field of genetics. A few scientists took interest. A few medical researchers noted it in their own investigations. And one researcher in particular, a man named Dr. James Morrison, who was working at a prestigious medical school in Boston, became intrigued. Morrison was involved in early genetic research, attempting to understand how traits were inherited, how they were passed from parents to children. He was interested in anomalies, in cases that didn't fit the expected patterns, because he believed that such cases could shed light on the mechanisms of inheritance. Morrison reached out to Fletcher. He asked if he could review Fletcher's original notes. He asked if it would be possible to conduct a new examination of Francis, this time with the more advanced techniques that were beginning to become available. Fletcher agreed. He helped facilitate contact between Morrison and Francis. It took some time for Morrison to arrange the necessary travel and the resources to conduct a new examination. He arrived at Francis's home in South Carolina in 1928. Francis was now in her mid-50s, a woman who had lived with this unusual condition for her entire existence. She had learned to accept it, to move through the world with it, to live despite the attention and the questions it generated. She agreed once again to submit to examination. This time, Morrison had access to more advanced equipment. He was able to conduct more detailed microscopic examination of her hair. He took samples. He prepared slides. He examined the cellular structure with greater precision than had been possible before. What he found was that the hair cells themselves appeared to be completely normal in all respects except for one. They contained no melanin granules. The absence was complete. The hair was white because the cells producing it simply did not have any pigmentation to impart. But here is where the story becomes even more remarkable. Morrison also conducted a careful examination of Francis's entire body. He was looking for any other signs of depigmentation, any other areas where pigment production had failed or ceased. And he found something. In several locations on her body, in areas that were normally exposed to sunlight, and in areas that typically remained covered, Morrison observed what appeared to be very faint patches of skin that seemed to have less pigmentation than the surrounding tissue. They were barely noticeable, so subtle that they could easily have been overlooked entirely. But Morrison, carefully examining Francis with meticulous attention, saw them. He asked Francis about these patches. Had she always had them? Had they changed over time? Could she remember when they had first appeared? Francis examined herself with Morrison, looking at the areas he was pointing out. She was not aware of them, or at least she had not given them significant thought. She had never noticed any significant changes in her skin, but now, focused on them, she began to consider. Had they always been there? She was not certain. She simply did not know. Morrison documented these observations carefully. He began to form a hypothesis. He theorized that Frances might have a form of what medical science was beginning to understand as a condition affecting pigment production across her body. But in her case, the condition manifested almost entirely in her hair, with only the most subtle effects elsewhere. This would have been extraordinary. Such a localized presentation of a pigment production anomaly would have been virtually unheard of. Over the following years, Morrison continued his research. He corresponded with Fletcher. He consulted with other researchers who were beginning to explore genetic mechanisms. He reviewed Frances's case repeatedly, analyzing it from different angles, looking for explanations that might account for what he observed. The 1930s brought new developments in the field of genetics. The understanding of hereditary mechanisms was advancing rapidly. Researchers were beginning to understand the role of genes, the structure of inheritance, the ways in which traits could be passed from generation to generation through mechanisms that were increasingly well understood and systematically categorized. Yet Frances's case remained anomalous, remained resistant to easy categorization. Morrison presented his findings at a medical conference in 1932. He described the case of Frances in detail. He showed photographs. He presented his microscopic findings. He outlined his hypothesis about a form of pigment production disorder that manifested primarily in hair follicles. The response from the medical community was mixed. Some researchers were fascinated. Some were skeptical. Some suggested alternative explanations. Some wondered whether there might be factors that Morrison had not considered, information that was missing from his analysis. One researcher in particular, a geneticist named Dr. Heinrich Schwarzer, who had emigrated from Europe to the United States, approached Morrison after his presentation. Schwarzer was interested in hereditary conditions, in genetic anomalies, in cases where inheritance patterns did not follow the expected models. He believed that Frances's case might be even more complex than Morrison had realized. He suggested that it might be worth investigating Frances's family history more thoroughly, looking at her parents' history, at her grandparents' history, attempting to understand what genetic material she carried and where it came from. This kind of detailed genealogical research was unusual at that time. Most people, particularly African Americans whose family histories had been disrupted by slavery, did not have access to detailed genealogical records. But Frances's case was unusual in many respects, and Schwarzer was determined. He began research into Frances's background. He looked at the records of the plantation where she was born. He examined what documentation existed about her parents. He researched what was known about her grandparents and their lineage before slavery had disrupted family connections and documentation. What Schwarzer began to discover was remarkable. Frances's family line traced back as far as records would allow showed no history of white hair, no history of pigmentation disorders, no genetic markers that would suggest predisposition toward such an anomaly. On her mother's side, the records indicated a family line that stretched back generations with no unusual characteristics. On her father's side, similarly, no record of anything remarkable. Yet Frances existed. She possessed this unusual trait, and she had not inherited it from her parents in any straightforward way. Her children did not possess it. It seemed to have emerged, full-formed, spontaneously in her alone. This suggested to Schwarzer that he was looking at a genetic mutation, a spontaneous change in the genetic material that had occurred either in Frances herself or in the reproductive cells of one of her parents that had created the condition. Schwarzer hypothesized that what he was witnessing was the result of a spontaneous genetic mutation that had produced in Frances a condition that affected melanin production. But, and this is the crucial point, the mutation seemed to have been expressed in a highly unusual way. Normally, genetic conditions of this type would either be expressed uniformly throughout the body or would not be expressed at all. The possibility of a mutation being expressed so dramatically in one system, hair follicles, while being almost entirely absent in others, seemed to contradict the understanding of genetics that was developing at that time. Schwarzer proposed that he conduct additional research on Frances. He wanted to examine her not just at one point in time, but over an extended period. He wanted to document any changes that might occur in her condition. He wanted to collect samples that could be analyzed with whatever advanced techniques became available. Most importantly, he wanted to track her descendants, Frances's children and grandchildren, to see whether any of them showed any signs of the condition, any indication that the genetic mutation she carried might be expressed in her offspring, even if it wasn't directly inherited. Frances agreed to participate in this extended research project. She became, in a sense, the first subject of a longitudinal genetic study, though that terminology had not yet been developed to describe what was being conducted. Over the following decade, Schwarzer visited her repeatedly. He examined her, he took samples, he documented changes or the lack thereof in her condition. He corresponded with members of her family. He took genealogical information from her children and attempted to track her grandchildren. In 1941, the Second World War began for the United States. The nation mobilized. Resources that had been devoted to pure research were redirected toward military and medical purposes. Many researchers abandoned their civilian research projects to contribute to the war effort. Dr. Schwarzer, who had family connections in Europe and complex feelings about the rising tide of fascism, threw himself into medical research that he believed could support the Allied efforts. His research on Frances was put on pause. The correspondence stopped. The visits ceased. Frances was left in her quiet town in South Carolina, suddenly no longer the subject of regular investigation and documentation. She was, in many ways, relieved. She had spent years being examined, being questioned, having samples taken from her. Now, unexpectedly, she was given a reprieve. She settled into a life of relative quiet once again. But Schwarzer did not forget about Frances, and the notes that he had accumulated over his years of research, the documentation that he had created, the analysis that he had begun, all of this was preserved. It was stored in university archives in files that would be transferred from institution to institution over the years, but that would not be destroyed. During the war years, other researchers continued working on genetic problems, though the focus had shifted. The study of genetics was taking on new urgency, new applications, new implications. After the war ended, as the full horror of the Holocaust became known, the world began to reckon with the ways in which genetics had been grotesquely misused by the Nazi regime. The field of genetics came under scrutiny. Questions were asked about the ethics of genetic research, about the implications of studying human traits, about the dangers that could arise when genetic science was weaponized or used to support ideology. In this post-war environment, much of the earlier research into individual cases of genetic anomalies was either abandoned or reevaluated. Researchers did not want to be associated with the kind of eugenic thinking that had dominated pre-war medical research in some quarters. Schwarzer himself, traumatized by what he had learned about the war, about the Holocaust, about the misuse of science, was less enthusiastic about continuing his research on Francis. He published one final paper in 1947, summarizing his findings, presenting his hypothesis about spontaneous genetic mutation, and then he largely set the matter aside. Frances herself was aging. The post-war years were years of relative stability for her. Her children had grown. Her grandchildren were coming of age. She watched the world change around her. The civil rights movement emerged. The nation began a slow, painful process of reckoning with racial injustice and inequality. Frances was not active in the movement. She was too old, too focused on her family and her quiet life. But she was aware of it. She saw the changes occurring. She understood in her own way the significance of what was happening. In 1968, 40 years after Schwarzer had stopped visiting Frances, a young medical student named Patricia Richardson discovered his papers in a university archive. Richardson was studying the history of genetics, exploring how the field had developed, examining cases that had shaped the thinking of geneticists. She came across Schwarzer's documentation of Frances. She was fascinated. She felt that there was more to investigate, more that could be learned from this case. Richardson tracked down Frances. This was now the late 1960s. Frances was very elderly in her 90s, living in a nursing home in South Carolina. She was still sharp mentally, still able to communicate, still capable of reflecting on her extraordinary life. Richardson visited her. She explained what she had found in the archives. She asked Frances if she would be willing to participate in one more investigation, this time with the benefit of technology and understanding that had advanced dramatically over the previous 40 years. Frances agreed. She was old enough now that she seemed to view the entire matter with a kind of distant curiosity. She had lived with this unusual condition her entire life. She had been studied multiple times. She had learned to accept that she was a medical curiosity. If allowing one more examination might advance science, might help someone else who had an unusual medical condition, then she was willing. Richardson brought in sophisticated equipment. This was 1968, well into an era when genetic testing was becoming more sophisticated, when the structure of DNA was well understood, when the mechanisms of inheritance were far better comprehended than they had been in Schwarzer's time. She took extensive samples from Frances. She conducted tests that Schwarzer could never have imagined. She examined Frances's hair at the cellular and molecular level, and what Richardson found was, in some ways, confirming of Schwarzer's hypothesis, and in other ways, completely unexpected. The hair was indeed produced by cells that were incapable of producing melanin. The genetic material within those cells showed evidence of an unusual mutation. But the mutation appeared to be localized. It seemed to be present in the hair follicle cells, but not in other cells in Frances's body that also normally produce melanin, such as certain skin cells. This was extraordinary. Richardson had found what appeared to be a chimeric condition, a condition where different cells in the body carried different genetic information. It was as though Frances carried two different genetic codes, one in her hair follicles and one in the rest of her body. This suggested a phenomenon that geneticists had theorized but rarely documented with such clarity. A spontaneous mutation that had occurred after conception, affecting only certain cell lines in the developing embryo. Richardson published her findings in a medical journal in 1970. The paper attracted significant attention in the genetics community. Here was a clear case of a somatic mutation, a mutation occurring in body cells after the zygote had been formed, that had produced a highly unusual and visible phenotype. Richardson's work was cited by other geneticists. Her paper became a reference point in the study of genetic mosaicism. Frances, meanwhile, remained in her nursing home. She was now in her late 90s. She was approaching the end of her life. She had lived through the entire span of American history from the aftermath of the Civil War through the late 20th century. She had been enslaved as a child. She had experienced freedom. She had lived through war. She had raised a family. She had become, unknowingly, the subject of one of the most significant medical case studies in the history of genetics. And still, few people beyond the medical and scientific community knew her name or her story. Frances died in 1972. She was 98 years old. Her death went largely unnoticed outside of her family and her local community. The local newspaper carried an obituary. A few people attended her funeral. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren mourned her passing. But in the broader world, she passed away without ceremony, without the acknowledgement that this woman who had lived through so much, who had embodied such an extraordinary medical mystery, should have received. However, her legacy in the scientific community continued. Patricia Richardson remained engaged with Frances's case even after her death. She continued to analyze the samples that she had collected. She continued to follow developments in genetic science, always with an eye toward understanding Frances's condition better. And in the 1980s, when DNA sequencing technology began to advance rapidly, Richardson retrieved some of the samples that had been preserved from Frances and submitted them for genetic analysis. The results were groundbreaking. The mutation that Richardson had theorized to exist in Frances's cells could now be identified with precision. It was a specific change in a gene responsible for the production of tyrosinase, an enzyme essential for the production of melanin. The mutation was located precisely, understood completely. But what was remarkable was that this mutation appeared to exist only in certain cells. It was clearly a somatic mutation, not a germline mutation. It had occurred in body cells, not in reproductive cells, which explained why Frances's children did not inherit the condition and why she could not pass it on to her descendants. But then something unexpected emerged from Richardson's analysis. She discovered something in the archived blood samples that had been taken from Frances, evidence of another genetic anomaly that had never been detected before. It was subtle, almost hidden, but it was there. There appeared to be a very small percentage of cells in Frances's blood that carried genetic material that didn't match the rest of her body. It was an incredibly small percentage, perhaps too small to be noticed before the advent of modern sequencing technology. But it was present. It suggested that Frances might have been, at least to some degree, a chimera on a more profound level than had been previously understood. This raised a disturbing possibility. What if Frances was not purely one individual genetically? What if she had absorbed genetic material from a twin that had not survived the pregnancy, that had never been born? This phenomenon, known as chimerism, where an individual carries genetic material from multiple sources, was theoretically possible but extremely rare. The fact that it appeared to be present in Frances suggested that her case was even more extraordinary than previously understood. Richardson published this finding. It generated significant discussion in the genetics community. Some researchers were skeptical, others were intrigued. Everyone agreed that it was highly unusual, and it added another layer of mystery to Frances's already extraordinary life. It suggested that at the very moment of her conception, at the very beginning of her existence, something profoundly unusual had occurred. Two genetic codes instead of one had begun developing. One had apparently been absorbed into the other, but traces of it had remained, undetectable until modern science had advanced far enough to reveal it.